This crime was committed against children and therefore may not be suitable for all listeners. Most people believe that if something truly terrible is going to happen, there will be signs. Raised voices, chaos, a moment where someone could have stopped it. But the Unbelievable Clancy Case didn't begin with screams. It began with a normal morning, a quiet house, a family doing everything they were told was right. And by the end of that day, 3 children were gone, and no one could agree on how to explain it. This isn't a story about monsters hiding in the dark. It's about something far more unsettling. What happens when the danger isn't visible, and the mind turns against itself while the world assumes everything is fine? Part 1. The life everyone thought they knew. Duxbury, Massachusetts is the kind of town people move to when they want things to feel settled. Tree-lined streets, historic homes, the ocean never far away, but never loud. It's quiet in a way that feels intentional, like chaos simply doesn't belong there. Patrick and Lindsay Clancy lived there with their 3 young children. From the outside, their life fit the town perfectly. Patrick worked as an engineer, steady hours, stable income, the kind of job that doesn't raise eyebrows. He was described as present, involved, reliable. Not distant, not volatile, just a normal everyday guy. Lindsay was a labour and delivery nurse. That detail mattered to everyone who would later hear this story. She was trained to bring life into the world, to recognise distress, and to stay calm in emergencies. Friends described her as organised, thoughtful, deeply invested in her role as a mother. She planned activities, took photos, kept routines. The children were dressed well, cared for, and visibly loved. There were absolutely no public signs of dysfunction. No police calls, no reports to child services, no social media posts hinting at despair. If anything, Lindsay appeared high-functioning, the kind of person who holds things together even when it's hard. And that is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because behind the version of Lindsay everyone else saw, there was another reality unfolding quietly, mostly out of view. After the birth of the Clancy's youngest child, Lindsay began to change. Not dramatically and not suddenly, and not in a way that alarmed people right away. And it wasn't rage either, nor was it detachment or neglect. It was something more internal. She struggled with anxiety. She reported feeling overwhelmed. She expressed fear, not of others, but of herself. Postpartum mental health issues are common, and Lindsay sought help. She was evaluated, then she was diagnosed, and then she was prescribed medication. From the outside then, this looked like the system working. Appointments were made, doctors were involved. Patrick adjusted his schedule to help at home. There was no sense that things were spiraling beyond control. But postpartum mental illness, especially at its most severe, doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like someone desperately trying to hold on. One of the most unsettling aspects of this case is how functional Lindsay remained. She didn't withdraw completely, and she didn't abandon responsibilities. She also didn't express violent thoughts publicly. In fact, she reportedly feared harm coming to herself. That distinction is critical. People often imagine danger as loud, threats, breakdowns, and visible instability. But in reality, some of the most dangerous mental states are quiet, rational sounding and deeply private. Lindsay was under care. Her medications were adjusted, some were stopped, and others were introduced. Anyone familiar with psychiatric treatment knows that medication changes can be destabilizing, especially when layered over postpartum hormonal shifts. Still, nothing outwardly screamed emergency, to the friends, to their neighbours, and to the town around them. This was still a family going about daily life. Photos from that period show ordinary moments. Children playing, family outings, and smiles that didn't look forced. There's no obvious before and after line you can point to and say, that's when everything went wrong. That's what makes this part of the story so disturbing. Because when people later try to understand how something unthinkable could happen in a place like Duxbury, in a home like this, to a family like theirs, they kept coming back to the same realization. There was no single moment where someone could have said, "This is where we should have known." In the days leading up to January 24th, 2023, Patrick had taken time off work to support Lindsay and the children. He checked in, he stayed involved, and he didn't leave her isolated. This wasn't neglect, nor was it abandonment. And this wasn't a family ignoring obvious danger. It was simply a household trying and believing they were doing the right things. And that's the part that people struggle with the most. Because if it can happen here, to these people, under these circumstances, then it forces an uncomfortable question. How many warning signs go unseen simply because they don't look like danger? So, nothing had happened yet. No crime, no headlines, no sirens. Just a family inside a quiet town living a life that appeared safe, while something invisible was quietly unraveling beneath the surface. And the most unsettling part, everyone involved believed they were already doing what they were supposed to. Part 2. Learning of the diagnosis. Postpartum mental illness exists on a spectrum. Many people experience sadness, anxiety, exhaustion. Those are real, painful, and often treatable. But at the far end of that spectrum is something else entirely. Postpartum psychosis. It is rare, it is severe, and it is frequently misunderstood, even by people who think they know what to look for. Postpartum psychosis isn't simply feeling overwhelmed. It's a break from reality. People experiencing it may lose trust in their own thoughts, develop intrusive beliefs that they don't recognize as false, feel an overwhelming sense of doom, and believe harm is inevitable or already happening. The terrifying part is that these thoughts don't always announce themselves as irrational. They often feel logical to the person experiencing them. One of the most important details in this case is what Lindsay reportedly feared. Not anger, not resentment, not other people. She feared herself. She expressed concern about harming herself, a sign that she knew something inside her was wrong. That awareness often leads people to seek help, which she did. From the outside, this looked like responsibility, but postpartum psychosis can twist fear into something else entirely. Instead of thinking, "I am dangerous," the mind shifts towards, "Something terrible is coming and I can't stop it." And that belief can become consuming. Lindsay was under psychiatric care. She was prescribed medication. Her prescriptions were adjusted. Some medications were discontinued and others were added again. To someone unfamiliar with psychiatric treatment, this might sound routine, but medication changes, especially during postpartum hormonal shifts, can create instability. Doctors often have to balance side effects, sedation, efficacy, which basically means the ability of something like a treatment, drug, or action to produce the desired or intended result, especially under ideal or controlled conditions, such as in clinical trials, for instance, and also safety for parenting. This is a narrow, fragile window. Too much medication and a person becomes disconnected or numb. Too little and symptoms can surge uncontrollably. There is no switch that simply turns psychosis off. And during this time, Lindsay remained outwardly functional. That's what makes this part of the story so difficult to accept. People often imagine psychosis as obvious. Obvious hallucinations, obvious ranting, and obvious visible chaos. But postpartum psychosis can hide behind calm speech, rational explanations, careful routines, and a desire not to scare others. A person may know that they are unwell, but not understand how unwell. They may still cook meals, still speak gently, and still care deeply, and at the same time be losing the ability to accurately judge reality. One of the most disturbing aspects of postpartum psychosis is the way it rewrites meaning. Thoughts don't feel intrusive, they feel urgent. Fear doesn't feel irrational, it feels protective. In some cases, people develop beliefs that suffering is unavoidable, harm is already occurring, and the world is unsafe in ways that others can't see. The person may feel trapped between unbearable fear and unbearable responsibility. And that fear doesn't always surface as panic. Sometimes it surfaces as quiet resolve. Another reason cases like this are so unsettling is how little people talk about these experiences, even after surviving them. People who recover from postpartum psychosis often say they didn't trust themselves enough to explain what they were thinking, they feared being judged or institutionalized, and they didn't have the language to describe what was happening. That silence isn't neglect, it's confusion, and confusion can be deadly. At this stage, nothing in the Clancy household suggested imminent catastrophe. There was medical care, there was family involvement, and there was also support. This wasn't a case of someone being abandoned. It was a case of illness outpacing understanding. And that's the part that leaves people unsettled. Because if danger doesn't always look like danger, and if care doesn't always prevent collapse, then where does safety actually come from? By this point in the story, nothing visible had happened. But something invisible had. A mind was slipping away from the reality everyone else shared. Quietly, gradually, and without warning signs most people recognize. And the most disturbing truth is this: the system was present, the family was present, and the help was present. And still, it wasn't enough. Part 3. The day that couldn't be undone. By the morning of January 24th, 2023, nothing looked different. That's the part people struggle with the most. There was no storm outside, no argument, no final confrontation. Just another winter day in Duxbury. Patrick Clancy had taken time off work in the days before. He was present and involved. That morning, he planned to run some errands. Something just ordinary and something routine. The kind of small absence that happens in every household, every day. Before leaving, he checked in on Lindsay. This moment would later be repeated endlessly in headlines, court filings, and public discussion. Not because it was suspicion, but because it was normal. He asked if she was okay. She said yes. There was no panic in her voice, no visible distress, no plea for help. Nothing that would stop someone from stepping out the door for a short time. Patrick left believing his family was safe. What's important to understand about this moment is that Lindsay wasn't isolated in the way people imagine danger. She wasn't abandoned. She wasn't cut off. She wasn't spiraling visibly. She was alone with her children in a house she knew intimately, surrounded by familiarity, routine, and the weight of responsibility. And for someone experiencing postpartum psychosis, familiarity can become a trap. The mind itself begins to close in on itself. Thoughts loop. Fear stops feeling hypothetical and starts feeling immediate. There is no clear line where intention forms. There is only momentum. At some point during Patrick's absence, the internal world Lindsay had been living in overtook the external one. This is the moment people want details about, and the moment details actually obscure the truth. Because the horror of what happened doesn't come from how, it comes from the fact that there was no interruption. No neighbour noticed, no alarm went off, no moment where someone intervened in time. What occurred inside that house unfolded quietly. When it was over, 3 children were gone. And even then, the story didn't end. Afterwards, Lindsay did not flee. She did not attempt to conceal what had happened. She did not construct an alternate version of events. Instead, she attempted to end her own life. This wasn't escape, and it wasn't evasion. It was collapse. She survived, but with catastrophic injuries that would ensure nothing about her life would ever be the same again. When Patrick returned home, he expected noise, movement, voices, the ordinary chaos of children. Instead, he walked into silence. What he found cannot be described in a way that does justice to the reality of it, and it doesn't need to be. Because the weight of this moment comes from a single, unbearable truth. The last person to leave that house alive returned to a reality that no longer existed. First responders arrived quickly. Lindsay was taken to the hospital under guard. The children were pronounced dead. And in a matter of hours, a quiet Massachusetts town became the center of a story people didn't know how to talk about. News outlets rushed to report what had happened, but struggled with the language. There was no clean narrative, no obvious villain, no clear warning signs the public could latch onto and feel safe again. Every version of the story sounded wrong, because it was wrong in the deepest sense of the word. By the end of that day, nothing about the Clancy family remained intact, but the questions had only just begun. Questions about responsibility, about illness, about prevention, about whether this could have been stopped, and if so, by whom. And in the days that followed, one question would quietly eclipse all the others. If everyone was doing what they were supposed to do, how did this still happen? Part 4. When tragedy becomes a debate. In the days after January 24th, the Clancy case stopped belonging to the family. It became public property. News headlines spread fast, but clarity didn't come with them. Every article seemed to ask the same question in a different way. How could this happen? And, just as quickly, the answers began to split. Almost overnight, the public reaction divided into 2 opposing narratives. The first was simple, emotional, instinctive. A mother killed her children. Nothing could excuse that. For many people, this was the only framework that made sense. It felt necessary, almost protective, to believe that such an act had to come from cruelty, evil, or intent. Because the alternative was terrifying. The alternative suggested that love, care, and illness could coexist and still end in catastrophe. The second narrative focused on something far harder to accept. That Lindsay Clancy was not operating with a stable grasp on reality. That this was not rage, revenge, or resentment, but the terminal point of a psychiatric collapse. That postpartum psychosis wasn't just a label being used after the fact, but something actively unfolding in real time. And these two stories could not coexist comfortably. Amid the noise, Patrick Clancy released a statement. It was not angry, it was not defensive, and it did not attempt to rewrite what had happened. Instead, it expressed grief and support for his wife. This shocked people. For some, it felt incomprehensible. For others, it felt like a devastating act of loyalty. Patrick described Lindsay as someone who loved her children deeply. He spoke about her illness, about the fear she lived with, and about the person she was before everything collapsed. And in doing so, he unknowingly stepped into the center of public judgment. Because once he spoke, people didn't just analyze what happened, they analyzed him. As the shock settled, a quieter question began circulating. One people were uncomfortable voicing out loud. Was anyone else responsible? Doctors, medication decisions, discharge protocols, warning signs that might have been missed. This wasn't about blame in a legal sense, not yet. It was about fear. Because if this tragedy happened despite treatment, despite support, and despite awareness, then it challenged a belief people rely on to feel safe. That doing, quote, everything right prevents the worst outcomes. Eventually, the case entered the legal system. Lindsay Clancy was charged with multiple counts of murder. But unlike most cases, this one didn't move quickly or cleanly. She was hospitalized, not jailed. Her physical condition was severe. Her mental state was central to everything. From the beginning, it was clear this would not be a typical trial. The legal focus shifted towards mental competency, criminal responsibility, and whether she understood the nature of her actions at the time. And with that shift came even more division. Some saw this as accountability being delayed. Others saw it as the justice system struggling to fit a human catastrophe into legal language that was never designed for it. As months passed, empathy began to erode. Online discussions turned sharper, more absolute. People didn't just disagree, they condemned each other for how they felt. Sympathy became controversial, compassion became suspicious, and silence became a statement. The case became less about the three children and more about what people believed should happen next. Punishment, treatment, incarceration, institutionalization. There was no outcome that didn't feel unbearable to someone. Lost in the arguments was a quieter reality. 3 children were gone, a family was destroyed, and no future outcome could undo that. Whether the court ultimately viewed Lindsay as criminally responsible, mentally incapacitated, or something in between, nothing would return what was lost. And Patrick Clancy would have to live in a world where grief and loyalty existed side by side, permanently misunderstood by strangers. By the time the legal process began to take shape, the case had already become something a lot larger than itself. Not a crime story, not a medical case study, but a mirror reflecting people's deepest fears about parenthood, mental illness, and how fragile, quote, normal really is. Part 5. No ending that feels like justice. By the time the Clancy case reached its final phase, most people were no longer asking what happened. They were asking something far more uncomfortable, because every possible answer just felt wrong. The justice system is built on assumptions that people understand their actions, that intent can be measured, and that punishment can balance harm. This case strained every one of those assumptions. If Lindsay Clancy was fully responsible, then the punishment would need to match an unimaginable loss, something no sentence could truly reflect. But if she was not fully aware, if her mind was operating under a distorted reality, then punishment risked becoming symbolic rather than meaningful. Either way, the outcome could never restore what was taken. Justice, in this case, was never going to feel like justice, only like damage control after something irreparable. What made this case especially unsettling was that it wasn't just Lindsay on trial, it was postpartum mental illness itself. Experts debated definitions, lawyers argued over diagnostic thresholds, the public tried to draw hard lines around something inherently unstable. But mental illness does not follow rules. It does not announce its breaking point, and it does not always look dangerous until it is. This case forced a realization many people resist. There are moments where illness hijacks a person so completely that intention becomes meaningless. That truth doesn't comfort anyone. It just leaves a void where certainty used to be. While the world debated theory and law, Patrick Clancy was living something much simpler and far heavier. Absence. Not only of his children, but of the future he had assumed was guaranteed. Every version of justice offered to the public still left him waking up alone in a life that no longer resembled itself. And perhaps the darkest part of all, there was no direction for his grief. No villain he could safely hate. No resolution that could give meaning to what happened. Only a permanent before and after. Cases like this linger because they refuse to stay in their category. It's not a crime story. It's not a medical cautionary tale. It's not a morality play. It sits in the space between them, where people are forced to confront the idea that catastrophe doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from collapse, and that is far harder to accept. As discussions grew abstract, one truth remained painfully concrete. 3 children lived. They were loved. And then they were gone. They did not get a say in illness. They did not get protection from systems still learning their limits. They became the silent center of a story that would always orbit them, even when their names faded from the headlines. Remembering them means resisting the urge to turn this story into an argument. It means sitting with the discomfort instead. The most disturbing lesson of this case is not that something went wrong, it's that so much went right, and it still wasn't enough. There was awareness, there was care, and there was intervention, and yet, the mind crossed a threshold no one could see in time. That realization offers no warning signs, no checklist, no sense of safety, only humility. This is not a story that was meant to scare you. It's meant to unsettle you. because it reveals something deeply human and deeply frightening. That love does not always protect, that illness does not always announce itself, and that sometimes tragedy happens quietly behind closed doors while the world assumes everything is fine. And the hardest truth of all? Some stories don't end with answers. They end with echoes.